All right, so we've got a massive weather story unfolding right now, and honestly, it's one of those setups that's going to shape everything from the next couple weeks all the way through winter. A powerful El Nino is building strength as we speak, and it's already leaving its fingerprints all over the country. The jet stream has been shifting around and firing off wave after wave of nasty thunderstorms across the middle of the country, up into the north, and over toward the east. That means we're still dealing with an above-average chance of damaging wind gusts, chunky hail, and even tornadoes right in the heart of August. At the same time, strong upper-level wind shear is basically putting a lid on tropical development over in the Atlantic. So hurricane season has been eerily quiet there, way quieter than a lot of people expected going into the summer. But zoom out a little further and you'll see the bigger climate picture is about to shift gears even more. Down across the southern part of the country, the heat has been absolutely relentless. And that brutal combination of high temps and thick humidity looks like it's going to hang around stubbornly well into what should be cooler fall weather. Basically, if you're tired of sweating, you might want to grab a tissue because this heat isn't packing up and leaving anytime soon. So let's dive into everything that's going on and break it all down piece by piece, because there's a lot to unpack here and it all connects together more than you might think at first glance. First things first, I really want to break down what El Nino actually is and how it's different from La Nina, because these two patterns swing our weather in totally opposite directions, especially once you get into hurricane season in winter. People throw these terms around a lot, but a lot of folks don't really know what's happening underneath the surface, literally. And trust me, this ties directly into what kind of winter we're about to have, so it's worth taking a minute to understand it. Right now, we're sitting in an El Nino pattern that's rapidly gaining steam, and it's trending toward what people call a Super El Nino, which is basically the strongest version of this pattern you can get. In plain terms, that means the water temperatures out in the Pacific Ocean are shattering records. And they keep climbing higher by the week, almost like clockwork at this point. If you look at a loop of the last couple months of ocean temperature data, it's honestly wild how much warmer that water has gotten in such a short stretch of time. The difference is noticeable even to the untrained eye. We're closing in fast on record territory, and this whole setup is looking a lot like the El Nino we experienced back in 2015, which, if you remember, gave us one seriously unusual winter, along with a pretty strange hurricane season too. So if history is any kind of guide here, we might be in for a repeat of that kind of unpredictable stretch. And that's exactly why meteorologists keep bringing up that year as a reference point every time this conversation comes up. Here's the domino effect that's playing out because of all that warm water sitting out in the Pacific. Over there, things have gotten extremely active. Tropical systems are popping up left and right like popcorn one after another. Meanwhile, on the flip side, that same warm water pattern is choking off storm development in the Atlantic almost completely. We've only seen 3 named storms form there all season so far, and honestly, I don't expect a huge number more, maybe 5 or 6 additional systems by the time everything wraps up in the fall, which would still make this one of the quieter Atlantic seasons we've had in a good while. But here in the continental US, our day-to-day weather has been anything but predictable. It's honestly felt like a roller coaster, with something new popping up on the maps just about every few days. This whole month of August has thrown one curveball after another, largely because a steady stream of Pacific moisture has been pouring into the country from the west. That extra moisture has cranked up monsoon season across the desert southwest in a big way more than usual for this stretch of summer, giving parts of the desert southwest a much wetter August than they're typically used to seeing. We've even seen flooding creep further north than you'd typically expect this time of year, which caught a lot of people off guard. A few weeks back, the Salt Lake City area actually got hit with tornado warnings, which is bizarre because that almost never happens out there. We're talking maybe the first time in a decade or more that warnings like that were issued in that region. So that really tells you how unusual this pattern has been. And it's the kind of thing that even longtime residents out there were talking about because it's just not something you see very often at all. On top of the moisture and storms, a warm pool of air parked over Baja California has been driving temperatures through the roof, and that's led to record-breaking heat in spots like Arizona and Southern California, with some places setting marks that hadn't been touched in years. The kind of numbers that make the local news because they're just so far outside the norm for the calendar date. Meanwhile, up north we've had a persistent northwesterly and westerly flow running for weeks now, and that's partly thanks to El Nino too. The flow has actually helped keep things cooler than normal across the Midwest and Northeast, even while Texas, Oklahoma, and the desert Southwest stay locked in that brutal heat with basically no relief valve in sight. It's honestly one of those patterns where 2 totally different worlds are existing side by side on the same map. One half of the country bundling up a little in the mornings, while the other half is sweating just walking to their car. So let's walk through what the next week or two is shaping up to look like, and why all of this could end up having a massive influence on our upcoming winter season too. Now, if you've been paying attention at all, it's pretty obvious El Nino has completely rewritten the script for this hurricane season, and not in the way a lot of forecasters originally expected. Right now, there's really only one zone worth watching in the Atlantic, and that little disturbance is likely to spin up into what would become Tropical Storm Dolly sometime in the next day or so. Even if it doesn't organize immediately, it could still become something as it tracks toward the Lesser Antilles down the road, so it's worth keeping tabs on. Compare that to the Pacific side of things, and it's basically chaos over there in a good way if you're into tropical weather. We've currently got 4 separate areas being watched, including 1 active tropical storm, 3 tropical depressions, and there's even a chance a typhoon could spin up near China before long. Here's a fun little detail for you weather nerds out there. Even though this particular event won't threaten any land, we've got 1 tropical depression drifting south and another drifting north at the same time out in the western Pacific. When that happens, you sometimes get what's called a Fujiwara effect, where the 2 systems basically start orbiting each other like a slow-motion dance out in the open ocean. It's a pretty rare and fascinating thing to watch play out on satellite. Honestly, one of the cooler things you'll see in tropical meteorology, and it's not something that happens every single year, so this is a fun one to point out. But getting back to the bigger picture, El Nino is generating a ton of wind shear along with dry air sitting over the Atlantic, and that combination is exactly why storm formation has been so limited there this year. Compare that to the Pacific, which has plenty of moisture and very little shear working against it. And you can see why one basin is thriving while the other is basically stuck in neutral, almost like 2 completely different weather worlds sitting right next to each other on the same map. That said, I do want to throw out a word of caution. If even one storm manages to get its act together in the Atlantic, it could ramp up in intensity extremely fast depending on where it tracks, simply because the ocean water out there is so warm and hasn't had any storms churning through it yet to cool things down and mix things up. So it really comes down to whether wind shear backs off enough to let something develop. But if a system does find that window, it could rocket up to major hurricane strength surprisingly quickly, potentially catching people off guard if they aren't paying close attention to how quickly these things can change. For right now, though, there's nothing alarming brewing in the Atlantic Ocean, so no need to panic just yet. It's kind of wild when you think about it. We're deep into what's usually the peak stretch of hurricane season, and the basin that normally gets all the attention is basically sitting on the sidelines, while everything interesting is happening thousands of miles away in the Pacific. That's a direct result of this El Nino pattern doing its thing, and it just goes to show how much influence ocean temperatures thousands of miles apart can have on storm activity closer to home. Before we shift over to talk about how all this connects to weather here at home, I want you to picture just how lopsided the tropics look right now, because it's honestly a pretty stark contrast. Over in the Pacific, we're talking about 7 separate systems all churning at once. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them, all spinning away at the same time. Meanwhile, the Atlantic might produce just a single storm over the entire next week. If that, it's honestly about as quiet as it gets over there. Practically dead calm for the foreseeable future, almost eerily still. Those 2 systems doing the little dance around each other, the Fujiwara pair, might actually merge into one larger tropical system eventually, which would be a really interesting thing to track, though thankfully it poses no threat to any coastline whatsoever. There's also more spinning up activity happening out in the eastern Pacific, while the Atlantic just sits there quiet as can be, almost like it's taking a nap while all the action happens on the other side of the country entirely. Poking at the American model, there's no tropical development shown anywhere in the Atlantic over the coming week, though I do think that Dolly's situation, which could take shape within the next day, might form somewhere east of the Lesser Antilles, and potentially cause problems down the line. But there's still a lot of uncertainty around exactly where that system, if it forms, would end up tracking Esses. We'll definitely keep a close eye on it and update you as soon as we know more solid information, since these early stage disturbances can sometimes surprise everyone once they actually get organized. Let's pivot now and talk about how El Nino is influencing our weather here in the States, starting with the jet stream, because honestly, this is the backbone of basically every weather pattern we deal with. It is kind of the engine driving everything else, and once you understand where it's sitting and how it's shaped, you can pretty much predict where the heat goes, where the storms go, and where the cooler air ends up parking itself. For a few weeks running now, we've had a stubborn area of high pressure parked over the southern plains and desert southwest, and for a lot of you living there, that has translated into scorching, oppressive heat day after day. Places like Dallas, us Oklahoma, and the broader desert southwest have been baking in triple-digit temperatures with basically zero relief in sight, and it's been dragging on for what feels like forever now, day after day of the same brutal setup, with barely any change on the horizon to break it up. It has honestly been brutal out there. Sure, there have been a handful of scattered showers here and there, but those only cool things down for a few hours at most before the heat slams right back in, so it hasn't provided any real lasting relief for anybody. Well, more of a tease than an actual break from the heat, if we're being honest about it. Meanwhile, up across the Midwest, Ohio Valley, and even into the Northeast, we've had a strong northwesterly flow, keeping temperatures noticeably below average for this point in the summer, and I expect that trend to hold through the final stretch of August at least. But once we flip the calendar into early September, that stubborn heat dome is expected to shift, sliding into the Central Plains, the Midwest, and the Tennessee Valley. When that shift happens, the jet stream is going to lift northward again, and that changes the whole game. What that likely means for the first week of September is that severe weather returns to the northern plains and Midwest, while heat builds hard across the lower Midwest, Ohio Valley, and much of the central and southern plains. That same shift will also bring drier conditions to those same regions, which could start becoming a concern the longer it drags on. So broadly speaking, the most intense severe weather threat during that stretch will probably sit in the northern plains, though some of that activity could spill into the Midwest and Great Lakes as that first week of September plays out, all while heat continues stacking up across the Great Plains. Eventually, though, that heat dome has to break down, especially as we inch closer to autumn, and historically we usually get at least one or two bigger storm systems that bring either widespread severe weather or a real shot of cooler air to knock things back down. My gut tells me we're probably only a week or two away from something like that finally showing up on the maps. So for the short term at least, expect our severe weather threats to stay pretty scattered and isolated rather than widespread. Heat is going to keep building, and eventually that heat has to get knocked out by some larger storm system that reintroduces a real severe weather threat to the picture. Now let's talk radar and the bigger picture over the next several days, because there's actually quite a bit going on if you know where to look. Today, we've got a storm system moving through the East Coast that could spark a bit of isolated, severe weather, maybe a couple of strong storms popping up over Nebraska and South Dakota later on. Heading into the weekend, a fresh storm system is expected to organize across the northern plains, and that could bring a handful of supercell thunderstorms into the Dakotas, potentially raising the tornado threat there too, though there's still plenty of uncertainty baked into that forecast at this point. Moving into Sunday and Monday, more storm activity looks likely across the Great Lakes, upper Midwest and Northeast. So those areas should stay on alert and keep an eye on the sky through that stretch of days. Beyond that stretch, I'm not really spotting any major storm systems on the horizon for a while. Things look fairly quiet after that initial round, which honestly might be a nice little breather for a lot of areas that have been dealing with active weather for weeks now. That said, I do think we'll see a noticeable uptick in bigger storms as we roll into the first and second weeks of September, and there's even a chance we could see snow showing up in the Rockies for the first time in quite a while, which would be a pretty early sign of the season starting to change over, and always a fun milestone for weather watchers to see. That's definitely something worth keeping an eye on going forward. The American model has actually been hinting that larger, more organized storm systems become a real possibility over the first 10 to 15 days of September, which would mean an elevated risk of severe weather in certain spots, plus the potential for some much colder air to come rushing down from up north. Just keep in mind, that's still more than 10 days out, so plenty could change between now and then. Models this far out tend to wobble quite a bit, flip-flopping, run to run before things finally start to lock into place closer to the actual date. Make sure you're following along so we can keep you updated with the latest, as this all develops over the coming days and weeks. Weather this time of year can flip on a dime, especially with a pattern this active, so it's always smart to check back in rather than relying on a forecast from a week ago. If you happen to be a fan of the heat, buckle up, because the next week or two is about to deliver in a big way, with temperatures spiking noticeably as we close out August. We're talking readings running 25 to 30 degrees above normal across places like Nebraska, Kansas, and back over into Iowa, which is a pretty significant departure from what's typical. The kind of gap that turns a normal late summer day into something that feels more like peak desert heat. Just to be clear, when I mention these temperature differences, I'm referring to how far off we are from what's typical for this time of year, not the actual raw numbers themselves. So there's a serious surge of heat building across the Great Plains heading into the weekend, and it doesn't look like it's letting up anytime soon. And it gets even more intense early next week, with temperatures potentially running 30 to 35 degrees above average across a huge stretch of land running from Oklahoma City all the way up through Minneapolis and Wisconsin, which is honestly a massive area to be dealing with that kind of extreme departure. So basically, expect an oven-like final couple days of August, followed by what should be a cold front arriving around Tuesday or Wednesday that knocks temperatures down at least somewhat across the northern plains, giving folks up there a bit of a breather after a long, sweaty stretch. That said, I think the core of the heat sticks around in the Midwest and Central Plains for the most part, refusing to budge easily. Cities like Kansas City and St. Louis will probably still be sitting around 25 to 30 degrees above normal during the opening days of September, so no quick relief for those areas anytime soon, unfortunately. Once we roll into that second week of September, though, the forecast confidence really starts to drop off quite a bit. The American model currently keeps that heat wave locked in place at least through the following Monday, then shows a significant blast of cold air arriving sometime around the second week of September. But that's just one possible outcome out of many different model runs. And there's a wide spread of possibilities being shown for that stretch of time. Everything from a lingering heat wave to a genuine cold snap, depending on which run you happen to look at. So the bottom line is, we genuinely don't have a clear read yet on exactly what temperatures will look like during that window. But for at least the next week or two, expect the heat to stick around and keep intensifying, especially for folks in the Midwest and Ozarks who have already had enough of it. If you're in one of these areas, now's probably a good time to keep the air conditioning running and check in on anyone who might struggle with these kinds of extended stretches of heat, because this isn't just a 1 or 2 day spike, it's shaping up to be a prolonged stretch. One last thing I want to leave you with before we wrap up, and it's a pretty big deal if you ask me. I think our overall storm track is going to shift noticeably southward as we move deeper into fall and winter, all thanks to this El Nino pattern that keeps strengthening. That kind of shift typically sets the stage for a much more active winter season across what's often called Dixie Alley along with the southern plains, meaning more frequent and potentially stronger storm systems rolling through those areas throughout the season. That's not to say the Midwest and Northeast are going to skip out on winter storms. Entirely, because they absolutely won't. They'll still get their fair share. But I do expect a noticeable increase in storm activity later in the fall and continuing into winter, specifically across the southern plains and east coast, which could make for a pretty eventful season down there if you live anywhere along that. Stretch from Texas over toward the Carolinas, this is definitely the kind of setup you'll want to keep tabs on as we get deeper into the year, because these patterns have a tendency to produce some pretty significant storm systems once they get rolling. We're actually planning to drop our very first winter outlook of the year here on the channel pretty soon, so if that's something you're interested in, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it when it drops. Expect that to land sometime around the first week of September, so keep an eye out for it. That pretty much wraps up everything for today's forecast breakdown, and hopefully that gives you a clearer picture of what's coming. Thanks so much for sticking around and watching all the way through. I really appreciate it. If you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything going forward, because there's a lot more where this came from. And honestly, with all this wild weather happening right now, plus El Nino continuing to strengthen heading into fall and winter, it might be worth grabbing a solid weather app to stay on top of everything that's coming. The free Weatherfront app is available on iOS, Android, and desktop, and you can grab it through the links below or just search for it directly in the Apple Store or Google Play Store. It takes like 2 seconds. It comes packed with live storm chaser feeds and live radar, all completely free, plus access to computer models and satellite imagery too, so it's definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. Thanks again so much for tuning in today, and we'll catch you in the next video or live stream.